Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we begin with a story that is, well, let's be honest, not exactly uplifting, but it is weird, slightly glamorous in a decayed way, and it makes for the perfect kind of bedtime history. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe stretch out under the blanket, because we're heading into Paris. Not postcard Paris with tourists at the Eiffel Tower. No, this is the Paris of the 1920s. The Paris that smelled faintly of stale absinthe, wet cobblestones, and way too much cigarette smoke. The Paris where everyone thought they were decadent artists or doomed geniuses, and at the center of it all was a shiny little white powder that would wreck entire generations. Heroin. Now, if you're thinking, wait, heroin, like actual heroin, weren't they supposed to be doing champagne and jazz? Yes, they were, but also heroin. Because nothing says between two world wars like chain-smoking Gauloise in a cafe while also quietly addicted to an opiate made by Bayer. Yes, Bayer, the same company that gave the world aspirin, that helpful little pill for headaches, and also heroin, which was originally marketed as a cough suppressant, because of course it was. And Paris in the 1920s was the perfect laboratory for this experiment in social decay. You had ex-soldiers trying to forget trench warfare. You had bored aristocrats who hadn't quite figured out that their world was over. You had American writers who showed up pretending to be broke geniuses, but still somehow managed to drink 3 times their rent in cocktails. And heroin fit into all of this like a glove, a very dangerous velvet glove. Let's drift back a little bit to see how we got here, because it's not like the Parisians just woke up one day and said, you know what's missing from this croissant? A little smack. No, the roots of this go back to the late 19th century, when science was very excited about turning plants into miracle drugs. Morphine was the big hit of the 1800s. Isolated from opium, it was used to treat pain, surgery, battlefield injuries, but it had a teeny tiny problem. People got addicted, very addicted. So naturally, the solution was to invent something less addictive. Enter heroin. And for a while, the branding worked. Heroin was sold in pharmacies. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, colds, and general malaise. You could buy it in little elegant vials. Imagine Chanel No. 5, but instead of perfume, it's pure opiate. By the time the 1920s rolled around, Paris was already swimming in it, and the city itself set the mood. Post-World War I Paris was this strange, fragile bubble of excess. They called it les années folles, the crazy years. Everyone was half celebrating survival and half waiting for the next disaster. So there was this feverish energy, jazz spilling out of smoky clubs, surrealist artists arguing about nothing in Montparnasse cafes, flappers wearing short dresses, and even shorter patients. The whole vibe was live fast because who knows what's next. And heroin slotted into that mindset very comfortably. Let's talk about some of the people tangled up in this little haze of decadence. Because heroin wasn't just the province of criminals and back alleys. It was mainstream, chic, and even intellectual. You had artists, aristocrats, writers, and dancers all quietly, or not so quietly, hooked. Take Jean Cocteau, poet, filmmaker, professional eccentric. He spent much of the 1920s in a romantic haze with his boyfriend, Raymond Radiguet, a young writer who looked like he had wandered out of a perfume ad. When Radiguet died tragically young, because of course he did, Cocteau spiraled straight into heroin. He even drew pictures of himself suffering through withdrawal because nothing says avant-garde like sketching your own sweaty breakdown. He was in and out of clinics for decades, always swearing off heroin, always coming back. It became part of his legend, the fragile, haunted genius. Then you had Josephine Baker, the American dancer who conquered Paris in a banana skirt. Now, Baker herself wasn't a heroin addict. She was far too busy being an international superstar and eventually a resistance hero. But she was surrounded by that world. Smoky cabarets where heroin was passed around like candy, wealthy patrons who thought exoticism and opiates were the height of sophistication. Imagine being on stage, performing for audiences where half the room was nodding off in a velvet stupor. It was that kind of atmosphere. And of course, there were the aristocrats. The French nobility had technically lost their political power by then, but they hadn't lost their ability to throw money at boredom. Heroin became one of those private amusements, something decadent to whisper about in salons. Picture a duchess in pearls sighing dramatically while her butler quietly refills her syringe case. Not exactly the Bastille storming they warned about. What made heroin in Paris different from, say, Prohibition America was that it wasn't underground. It wasn't the forbidden fruit. It was just there. You could still find it in certain pharmacies. Doctors didn't completely grasp how destructive it was, or they pretended not to, and the law was incredibly slow to catch up. So the whole 1920s generation drifted through this fog, barely noticing that they were sinking. And it wasn't just Paris. Berlin was equally awash in drugs. London had its share. New York was no innocent either. But Paris had this special aura, the city of art, love, sophistication. So its heroin scene feels somehow more theatrical, like everyone was playing a role, even while their lives quietly unraveled. Let's float back to Jean Cocteau for a second, because he really is the poster child for this whole phenomenon. He once wrote that heroin was his faithful companion, which is both sad and incredibly on brand for a French poet. He tried to kick the habit by retreating to a clinic in the south of France, where he filled notebooks with diary entries and doodles about his withdrawal. His friends would visit, encourage him, and then often bring more heroin because friendship, I guess? He would relapse, recover, relapse again. It was less of a straight line and more of a carousel, a very slow, tragic carousel. Meanwhile, doctors began to notice that all of these supposedly safe heroin users weren't exactly doing well. Respiratory issues, collapsed veins, nervous breakdowns. By the late 1920s, the shine was definitely wearing off. France, like other countries, began to tighten regulations. Pharmacies no longer sold it so openly. Police raids became more common. But by then, a whole generation of artists and elites had already been touched by it. And the irony was thick. Because heroin had started as this miracle cure, the respectable cousin of morphine. It was supposed to make medicine safer. Instead, it turned into the ultimate fashionable poison of the interwar years. You could almost write a little tragic metaphor about it. The bright, hopeful new Paris of the 1920s secretly hollowed out by the very thing it thought it would cure it. Let's glide over to one more corner of this scene. The Americans in Paris. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, the so-called lost generation. Now, they weren't heroin addicts in the main sense. They were too busy with alcohol. Oceans and oceans of alcohol. But they existed in the same circles, the same cafes, the same smoky basements. And heroin was always nearby. Some dabbled, some avoided, but the presence of it added to that general haze of excess. The sense that Paris was one long, slow-motion collapse, disguised as a party. So when we think of the 1920s Paris heroin craze, We're not talking about street gangs or dark alley junkies. We're talking about cafe philosophers, aristocratic hostesses, avant-garde painters, lonely poets, all gently poisoning themselves while sipping espresso. It was decadent, tragic, and oddly boring in the end. Because addiction, for all its glamour at the start, becomes routine. The same doses, the same excuses, the same sighing into the void. Perfect bedtime material, really. And that's where we'll pause for now. In the next part, we'll keep drifting deeper into the haze, looking at more of the characters who got caught, the slow legal crackdown, and how heroin shifted from fashionable chic to underground taboo. But for tonight, just remember this. Paris may have been the city of light, but in the 1920s, it was also the city of needles, powders, and one very ironic. So let's pick up where we left off. Paris in the 1920s, where everyone seemed to be either painting something surreal, writing something incomprehensible, or quietly mainlining Bayer's cough syrup. By the end of the decade, though, the shine on this chic little poison was wearing off. Because as fun as it was to pass syringes around in smoky Montparnasse basements, heroin had one problem. Well, technically several, but let's start with the obvious. It destroyed people. And when too many people start collapsing in public, governments tend to notice. Even French governments, which were generally more tolerant of their citizens, slowly ruining themselves in the name of art. The first whispers of change came in the medical journals. Doctors who had been happily prescribing heroin for colds began to notice that their patients didn't just cure their coughs, they also kept coming back, pale, thin, and begging for more. Not exactly the miracle cure Bayer had promised. By 1924, the League of Nations, basically the world's very ineffective hall monitor, decided heroin probably shouldn't be handed out like candy. A few regulations trickled in, pharmacies tightened access, but Paris being Paris, enforcement was, let's say, relaxed. So while on paper, heroin was now frowned upon, in practice it was still there, especially in the cafes and salons where the elites gathered. Because let's be real, laws apply differently when your address is Avenue Foch and your dinner companions are Picasso and Gertrude Stein. Speaking of Gertrude Stein, her house in Rue des Fleurus wasn't exactly a heroin den, but it was definitely the nerve center of the lost generation. Hemingway would show up, Fitzgerald would stumble in, painters would argue about colors no one else could see. And in that swirl of eccentricity, heroin floated in and out like an uninvited guest who somehow always got a seat at the table. Most of Stein's circle preferred alcohol. It was cheaper, easier, and came in enormous quantities. But heroin hovered around the edges, the quieter, creepier cousin at the party. Let's pause here for a moment with F. Scott Fitzgerald, because if anyone embodied the whole decadent self-destruction thing, it was Scott. He and Zelda swept into Paris like glamorous moths to a very dangerous flame. They drank, they danced, they argued loudly in public. Hemingway, famously grumpy, couldn't stand Zelda and wrote her off as crazy. But heroin? Well, Fitzgerald himself didn't dive deep into it. He was far too married to gin. Still, his world was full of people experimenting with every possible substance. You can almost picture him watching some fragile poet in a corner, nodding off into a plate of oysters and thinking, ah yes, Paris. Meanwhile, Jean Cocteau was still battling his own carousel of addiction.
Every time he swore off heroin, he ended up back in a clinic. And in a very French twist, he turned the whole ordeal into art. His notebooks from withdrawal became published works with sketches of himself looking like a ghost wrapped in blankets. Only in Paris could heroin withdrawal become a coffee table book. And then there was Kiki de Montparnasse. She was the queen of the bohemian scene, model for painters, muse for photographers, singer, lover, chaos incarnate. Kiki was everywhere in the 1920s, laughing too loudly, posing for Man Ray, drinking entire bottles of wine before breakfast. Now, Kiki's main poison was alcohol, not heroin, but again, the scene she thrived in was saturated with it. And when you think about the way she burnt out so quickly, dying young and penniless, you can see how the drug-soaked atmosphere contributed to the general collapse of so many lives. So yes, by the late 1920s, Paris was still riding the heroin wave, but cracks were starting to show. The French police, who had spent most of the decade ignoring the problem, began to get pressure from international bodies. Other countries were panicking about their own drug epidemics. The U.S., in particular, was loudly clutching its pearls, even though half of New York was doing the exact same thing. France reluctantly tightened the screws. Raids happened. Pharmacies quietly pulled products. Heroin started slipping out of the elegant salons and into the underground. And here's where it got interesting, or in our sleepy tone, let's say quietly ironic. Because once heroin was harder to get legally, the exact same elites who had been casually injecting it with their morning espresso suddenly found themselves buying it from shadier sources. The glamour faded fast. Nothing kills an aristocratic vibe like haggling with a street dealer. The result was that heroin slowly lost its place as the chic drug of Paris. By the 1930s, it had become something else entirely. Not glamorous, not poetic, just sad. The artists moved on to other substances. Alcohol, of course, remained the king. Cocaine had its little moments. But heroin became more associated with the desperate, the addicted, and the criminal. Exactly the opposite of how it had started. Let's drift for a moment into the broader irony here. Because Paris wasn't unique. The whole Western world was going through the same cycle. Introduce a new drug with medical fanfare, declare it safe, sell it everywhere, watch as people collapse, crack down, push it underground, repeat. Morphine, heroin, cocaine, they all went through the same carousel. Paris just dressed it up in better outfits and played jazz in the background. Now, about those jazz clubs, because we can't talk about 1920s Paris without mentioning the music. The arrival of jazz from America electrified the city. Black musicians escaping the racism of the United States found a much warmer welcome in Paris. Clubs like Bricktops became the center of nightlife. The energy was wild, the music intoxicating. And in the corners of those smoky rooms, yes, more heroin. Jazz and opiates became entwined in the cultural imagination, partly because both represented a kind of sensual escape from reality. But while the music soared, the drugs quietly ate away at the people playing them. One of the sadder examples was the jazz violinist Michel Warlop. A gifted musician, he slid deep into heroin addiction and never climbed out. His career collapsed, his health crumbled, and he died far too young. He wasn't the only one. The pattern repeated over and over again. Brilliant talent, a few glorious years, then decline. And yet, in the moment, it all felt normal. The 1920s were about living in the present, no matter how self-destructive. People weren't thinking about the long-term consequences. They were thinking about the next drink, the next song, the next vial passed under the table. Heroin fit that mood perfectly until suddenly it didn't. By the time the 1930s rolled in, Paris had sobered up. Well, relatively speaking. The depression, political instability, and the looming shadow of another war made the wild decadence of the 1920s feel like a fever dream. Heroin was no longer chic. It was a problem, something the state actually began to police. Users who had once been glamorous were now whispered about. Addiction became stigma, not style. And many of the figures who had danced through that golden haze were gone, dead, broke, or permanently damaged. But in the sleepy spirit of tonight's history, let's not frame this as a sharp downfall. Let's just imagine it as the slow dimming of a very strange party. The music fades, the lights go down, the last cigarette burns out in an ashtray, and heroin, once passed around like an exotic treat, slips quietly into the shadows. What remains is the memory. The stories of Cocteau sketching his withdrawal, the jazz clubs echoing with music while someone nodded off at the bar, the aristocrats sighing into their syringes, the lost generation trying to drown their trauma, some with alcohol, some with opiates, none of them succeeding. And so, the heroin craze of 1920s Paris ended not with a bang, but with a yawn. A long, slow fade into obscurity as the world lurched toward the next disaster.
So we've lingered in Paris cafes, watched poets collapse elegantly, and followed aristocrats into the world's most awkward pharmacy visits. But heroin's story doesn't just stay in Paris. No, like all bad habits, it spreads. And the 1920s Parisian craze was really just one glamorous stop on heroin's slow, depressing world tour. Because here's the thing, once a drug gets introduced, it doesn't politely stay in one city, sipping espresso and smoking cigarettes. It goes everywhere. And heroin, by the late 1920s, had already seeped into every crack of the Western world. Paris may have dressed it up in pearls and jazz, but London had its attics, Berlin had its clubs, New York had its speakeasies. Even little provincial towns had that one sad pharmacy where cough syrup was selling a bit too well. Let's drift to Berlin, because if Paris was decadent, Berlin was something else entirely. We're talking the Weimar Republic years, when the whole city seemed determined to outdo itself in chaos. Cabaret, drag shows, politics swinging from left to right, and drugs everywhere. Cocaine and morphine were already flowing. Heroin joined the party with ease. Berlin in the 1920s was basically a laboratory of excess, except instead of lab coats, you had feather boas. Addicts weren't hidden, they were part of the scenery. And while Paris had Cocteau sketching his own withdrawals, Berlin had entire nightclubs where people didn't even bother pretending to be sober. Now, if we float over to London, the atmosphere was a little less flamboyant, but no less opiated. The British had a long relationship with opium, thanks, in no small part, to their colonial adventures in China. So heroin was just the modern update to an old habit. London addicts tended to be tucked away in quiet flats, rather than dancing on tables. But the end result was the same, pale, shaky figures chasing doses, while respectable doctors pretended they hadn't prescribed it in the first place. And of course, New York. The Roaring Twenties in America usually conjures up images of jazz, speakeasies, flappers, and bootleg whiskey. But heroin was quietly there too. In fact, some of the earliest American gangsters found it a very profitable product. Prohibition had given them a taste for smuggling, and heroin was just another thing to sell.
By the late 1920s, New York was already on the edge of its own drug crisis. So while Paris gave heroin glamour, New York gave it crime. Not exactly a trade anyone needed. Back in France, the government was reluctantly tightening control. By the 1930s, heroin was no longer chic, no longer pharmacy-friendly, and definitely not something you bragged about at dinner parties. International agreements were forcing countries to restrict it. The League of Nations, yes, that famously ineffective pre-UN, pushed for global treaties limiting heroin production. And France grudgingly complied. Pharmacies stopped stocking it, doctors stopped prescribing it, users had to find other ways. And here's where the global irony comes in. Because while Europe and the US were slowly trying to get heroin under control, production was just moving elsewhere. The opium poppies that fed the heroin factories didn't vanish. They shifted to new markets, new suppliers. Colonial connections made it easy. French Indochina, modern Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia became a key source of opium. And guess what? That pipeline would come back to haunt everyone later in the century. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, it's still the 1930s, and Paris is nursing a collective hangover. So what happened to the people? The famous addicts, the artists, the elites? Some staggered on. Jean Cocteau lived until 1963, outlasting most of his generation. He spent decades trying to quit heroin, never fully succeeding, but somehow still managing to produce art, films, plays, poetry. He became living proof that you could be both extremely addicted and extremely productive, which is not exactly a helpful role model. Others weren't so lucky. Countless minor artists, musicians, and aristocrats disappeared into obscurity. They died young, or they lived long enough to become sad anecdotes. Addiction rarely leaves behind dramatic stories. It leaves behind unfinished novels, empty bottles, unpaid bills, which is frankly perfect for a bedtime history, because there's nothing more monotonous than endless cycles of relapse and regret. Meanwhile, the myth of Paris lingered. Later generations looked back on the 1920s with romantic nostalgia. The cafes, the jazz, the artists scribbling manifestos. People conveniently forgot the part where half the room was high on heroin or dying of tuberculosis. In Hollywood movies and tourist brochures, the lost generation became glamorous, not tragic. And heroin, once the chic drug of choice, was erased from the picture because nothing kills romance like needles. But heroin itself didn't go away. By mid-century, it had fully transformed into something else. Not a fashionable indulgence, but a public menace. The glamorous duchess with her syringe case was gone. In her place was the stereotype of the back alley junkie, the desperate addict, the shadowy criminal. Same drug, different image. And here's the long, slow irony. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris ended up shaping how we think about drugs in general. The whole cycle, medical miracle, fashionable indulgence, social problem, criminal stigma. It's the same story. Paris just wrote one of the more stylish early chapters. Let's float back for a moment to the jazz clubs in Paris, because they really embody the paradox. Picture a smoky room in Montmartre. The band is playing, the crowd is swaying, Josephine may be in the corner laughing. Everyone looks alive, glamorous, free. But behind the music, some of the players are struggling to keep their lungs working. Some of the audience will stumble out into the night, pale and unsteady, hunting for the next dose. In the moment, it feels magical. In hindsight, it was just decay dressed up as style. And that's really the legacy of heroin in 1920s Paris. It wasn't about crime waves or gang wars. It wasn't about mass epidemics in poor neighborhoods. It was about decadence at the top, self-destruction among the talented, irony in the extreme. A miracle drug turned a fashionable poison, embraced by the very people who thought they were the height of sophistication. So when you picture Paris in the 1920s with its artists and flappers and jazz, just remember, behind the glow of the lights and the clinking of glasses, there was always that quiet hiss of a syringe, the powder in a tiny vial, the sigh of someone too tired to keep pretending. The city of light, indeed, but with a shadow just under the surface. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The heroin craze didn't vanish. It just shifted, transformed, and resurfaced later in uglier forms. But Paris in the 1920s gave it its most glamorous costume. A costume, like everything from that decade, eventually fell apart at the seams.
So here we are. The party in Paris is fading. The champagne is flat, the gramophone is skipping, and someone has just realized the rent is 3 months overdue. Welcome to the 1930s. The heroin craze of the 1920s didn't vanish overnight. It limped along like a jazz musician refusing to leave the stage long after the crowd has gone home. But the atmosphere had changed. The world was sliding into depression, literally and economically. The stock market crashed in 1929, and suddenly people had bigger problems than finding the chicest new drug. Breadlines are not glamorous, and heroin addictions are harder to fund when you're broke. Paris itself sobered up, at least compared to its earlier haze. The cafes were still full, the artists were still scribbling, but the energy had dimmed. The reckless euphoria of the crazy years gave way to something more cautious, more anxious. And heroin, once the fashionable accessory of poets and duchesses, became less visible. Not gone, of course, it never truly leaves, but less center stage. Crackdowns and paperwork. By this point, the French state had finally accepted that maybe, just maybe, heroin was not the miracle cure Bayer promised. International treaties from the League of Nations required tighter control, and the government reluctantly put its bureaucratic machinery to work. Doctors were monitored, pharmacies scrutinized, and addicts quietly pushed to the margins. It's worth pausing to appreciate how slowly this happened. France, like many countries, moved at the pace of paperwork. Laws were passed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Addicts with the right connections still found supplies. But the days of casually buying heroin over the counter with your aspirin were done. Now it took effort, and effort is never glamorous. For the artists who had glamorized heroin in the 1920s, this was a problem. Addiction thrives in routine, and when that routine is disrupted, life gets messy. Jean Cocteau kept trying to quit, kept failing, kept turning the whole process into more art. He was like the poster child for elegant suffering, still attending salons, still producing, but always circling back to the same habit. He wasn't alone. A quiet network of addicts lingered through the 1930s, less public, more shadowy, but still there. The lost generation grows older. Meanwhile, the so-called lost generation was aging. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Stein, their glory days in Paris were already behind them. Fitzgerald's health collapsed, Zelda's mental illness worsened. Hemingway moved on to more violent hobbies. The Paris heroin haze didn't dominate their stories anymore, but its echoes remained in the culture they left behind. The novels of the 1930s were heavier, darker, less intoxicated. It's as if the drugs wore off and everyone realized the hangover was permanent. Enter World War II. And then, of course, the whole party was interrupted by something a little louder, World War II. Because nothing clears a cabaret like German tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées. The war changed everything about Paris. The cafes emptied, the jazz dimmed, and heroin, like most luxuries, became scarce. Supply chains collapsed, pharmacies were tightly controlled, and addicts faced a brutal reality: withdrawal in the middle of an occupied city. Not exactly the chic image of the 1920s. It's almost hard to imagine, but while the world was convulsing in violence, some people were still quietly fighting their own private battles with addiction.
No jazz, no salons, no witty asides, just ration cards, blackouts, and cravings. The glamour was completely gone. What remained was only the raw, repetitive suffering of dependency. And yet, even here, irony lingered. The Nazis, in their infinite hypocrisy, had their own complex relationship with drugs. German soldiers were famously dosed with methamphetamine, sold as Pervitin, to keep them marching. So while Parisian addicts were cut off from heroin, the occupying forces were high on stimulants. A different drug, same story. Science promising miracles, delivering disasters. The forgotten addicts. The war years are not full of glamorous heroin stories, and that's partly the point. Addiction, stripped of its Parisian costumes, was just dull, sad, and forgotten. Many addicts died quietly, either from withdrawal, lack of care, or the general brutality of war. Others survived, scarred, and diminished. When the war ended, they weren't remembered as part of the Great Resistance or the liberation or the rebuilding. They were just gone. But memory works strangely. After the war, when people looked back on the 1920s, they remembered the light, not the shadow. They remembered Josephine Baker dancing, Hemingway scribbling, Fitzgerald drinking, jazz spilling into the streets. The heroin haze was conveniently edited out. It didn't fit the myth of the golden age of Paris. And so the addicts of the 1930s and 40s slipped into obscurity, their stories replaced with rosier nostalgia. The rise of the myth. By the late 1940s, Paris was rebuilding. Tourists returned, artists regrouped, cafes filled again, and the memory of the 1920s had already hardened into legend. Les hommes folles, the crazy years, glamorous and reckless. Books and films romanticized the lost generation. Tourists came looking for Hemingway's cafes, Cocteau's haunts, the places where history was made. Few wanted to hear about the needles in the back rooms or the wasted figures nodding off in the shadows. This is the great irony of history. The boring, sad parts get erased, and the lively, glittering fragments get magnified. Paris in the 1920s is remembered as a carnival of art and excess, not a quiet epidemic of addiction. And yet, if you look closely, the heroin was always there, woven into the fabric. A quiet shift. By the end of the 1940s, heroin's reputation had changed completely. It was no longer chic, no longer fashionable. It had become a public menace, something to be stamped out. Governments worldwide were tightening bans. Smuggling networks were adapting. The drug that had once been sold in neat little vials by Bayer was now a contraband substance, hunted by police. And Paris moved on. The city had bigger things to worry about: reconstruction, politics, existential philosophy. Sartre and de Gaulle filled the cafes now, chain-smoking, debating the meaning of existence, but heroin wasn't their focus. The drug slipped underground, hidden in shadows, far from the glamour of its earlier heyday. The curtain closes. So if we think of heroin in Paris as a play, the 1920s were the dazzling opening act. Bright costumes, loud jazz, champagne bubbles. The 1930s were the second act, slower, sadder, with the set collapsing. And the 1940s were the curtain call. Quiet, gray, interrupted by war, the actors shuffling off stage. By the time the lights came back on, the audience had already rewritten the story in their minds. The tragedy was forgotten, the glamour remained. And that, in its own way, is the most Parisian ending possible. A city that loves beauty and myth, quietly erasing the messy parts, leaving behind a polished memory for future generations to admire.
So, by the time the dust of World War II settled, Paris had sobered up, literally and metaphorically. The cafes were no longer hosting flapper dances and surrealist manifestos. Instead, they filled with existentialists, chain-smoking, frowning, and asking each other if life had meaning. Spoiler, they never decided. Heroin, by this point, was no longer chic. It wasn't the quiet companion of poets anymore. It had gone underground, and like any drug pushed underground, it adapted. If the 1920s were about aristocrats sighing into their syringes, the 1950s and 1960s were about organized crime realizing that heroin was worth a lot more than size. Enter the French Connection. If you've ever heard of the French Connection, you probably think of the 1971 American film. Gritty cops, car chases, Gene Hackman looking perpetually irritated. But before it was a movie, it was very real, and Paris was right at the center of it. Here's how it worked. French-controlled Indochina had been producing opium for decades. That opium could be refined into heroin. Marseille, with its busy port and helpful proximity to the Mediterranean, became the hub. Corsican gangs who had cut their teeth in smuggling during the war stepped in to handle the logistics. The product flowed from Southeast Asia to Marseille labs, and from there across the Atlantic to the United States. The U.S. had a growing market. Post-war America has soldiers returning with all sorts of traumas, young people experimenting with drugs, and organized crime networks eager to expand beyond alcohol and gambling. Heroin fit neatly into the mix. And thanks to the French Connection, much of it passed through France. So, in a twist of irony, Paris went from being the city where heroin was fashionable in salons to being the logistical stopover where heroin was packaged, shipped, and smuggled. Not nearly as glamorous, but far more profitable. The Corsican Connection. Let's drift into Marseille for a moment, because if Paris was the face of France, Marseille was its rougher set of hands. The port city had always been a little unruly. Fishermen, sailors, dock workers, smugglers. During World War II, Corsican gangs had carved out influence by working with both the resistance and, at times, the occupiers. After the war, they controlled the docks, which meant they controlled what came in and what went out. And what was going out was increasingly heroin. The Corsicans set up labs refining opium into pure heroin, often at shocking levels of purity, sometimes 90%. For comparison, most street heroin today hovers far lower than that. American addicts in the 1950s and 60s were suddenly getting doses far stronger than they expected. Overdoses skyrocketed, but for the smugglers, it was business. Paris itself wasn't full of addicts anymore, not in the same way as the 1920s. The heroin moving through France was largely for export, which adds another layer of irony. The city that had once glamorized heroin was now shipping it abroad while pretending to have cleaned up its act. The official blind eye. French authorities, of course, were supposed to crack down, and eventually they did. But in the early years, let's just say the Corsican gangs had friends in useful places. Police looked the other way. Politicians pretended not to notice. The heroin trade quietly flourished. For Parisian society, this meant that heroin was no longer a fashionable indulgence at all. It was something whispered about in connection with crime. The addicts left in the city were no longer poets in velvet jackets. They were the marginalized, the forgotten, the people who didn't make it into glossy tourist brochures. And yet, at the same time, Paris was still selling itself to the world as the city of romance, lights, and art. A city carefully editing out its heroin problem while the docks of Marseille pumped out product for the world. Meanwhile, in America, on the other side of the Atlantic, heroin was becoming a full-blown social crisis. By the 1950s and 1960s, major U.S. cities were seeing waves of addiction. Soldiers returning from Korea, jazz musicians, working-class neighborhoods, all were touched by the flood of French Connection heroin. The purity was so high that overdoses became common. The American press, never one to resist melodrama, painted heroin as the great scourge, the destroyer of youth, the enemy at the gates. And where did much of it trace back to? France. The irony was delicious. Paris in the 1920s made heroin chic. Paris in the 1950s made heroin global.
And yet, Paris today is remembered for neither. Instead, it's remembered for art, literature, romance, jazz. The heroin is erased, hidden under the table like an empty bottle no one wants to claim. But history doesn't really erase. It just nods off for a while. So, Paris in the 1950s and 1960s had quietly evolved. The city itself kept selling the fantasy. Jazz, cafes, flaneurs wandering through Montparnasse, artists scribbling in notebooks. Meanwhile, Marseille was busy refining opium into heroin and shipping it across the Atlantic. It was a convenient separation. One city exported romance and nostalgia, the other exported chaos in a little glass vial. By the 1970s, though, the little game that had worked for decades began to unravel. American authorities were not about to keep pretending heroin wasn't a problem. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, they were all drowning in the product from the French Connection. The newspapers were shrieking, politicians were panicking, and the DEA was newly empowered. So they set their sights on the source, Marseille. The crackdown begins. It's worth noting how slowly and clumsily these things usually happen. Law enforcement didn't swoop in and magically end the trade overnight. No, they spent years building cases, infiltrating networks, and quietly gathering intelligence. French authorities, who had been somewhat complicit or at least complacent for decades, now had to respond. There were raids, arrests, and sting operations, mostly coordinated with the Americans. And here's the irony. The very people who had made heroin chic in Paris, the literary salons, the flappers, the lost generation, had been gone for decades. Their needles were gone, their stories absorbed into myth. Yet the drug they popularized in salons had grown into a global operation, and now, decades later, the city that once pretended to ignore it had to face the consequences. The kingpins of Marseille. The Corsican gangs who had controlled Marseille's docks and labs since the 1940s were the obvious targets. Men like Paul Carbone and his successors had quietly built an empire. It wasn't a glitzy empire. There were no velvet curtains, no champagne, no literary salons, just warehouses, boats, and lab chemicals. The American press loved to make them sound like glamorous villains. The French press was a bit more reserved, but still fascinated. There's something about organized crime that invites storytelling, but the reality was more boring than the myth. Men quietly moving products, avoiding the cups, laundering money, making sure the supply chain kept humming. Efficiency, not decadence, ruled. Operation in action. In the early 1970s, law enforcement finally started hitting hard. Wiretaps, undercover agents, international cooperation, the usual. They dismantled labs, arrested key figures, and seized shipments before they could leave the port. Heroin prices fluctuated, distribution networks were disrupted, and the Corsican gang's dominance slowly eroded. The American press naturally framed this as the end of the French Connection, complete with cinematic flair. And in some ways, it was true. Marseille was no longer the dominant hub of heroin smuggling, but the market didn't disappear. It just shifted. New routes opened up, from Turkey, from Southeast Asia, from other parts of Europe. Drugs, like history, adapt. Cultural shift. Meanwhile, heroin's image and culture had fully changed. The Parisian salons of the 1920s, gone. The jazz clubs and cafes, nostalgic. What remained in public consciousness was a new stereotype: the urban addict, the marginalized user, the crime-linked junkie. Heroin was no longer a fashionable indulgence. It was a social problem, a threat to communities, a reason for alarm. This shift wasn't immediate, of course. In the 1960s and early 1970s, there was still a tiny remnant of glamour in some artistic circles. Some musicians experimented, some writers dabbled, but the narrative had fundamentally changed. The needle was no longer chic. It was dangerous, shameful, and increasingly illegal. And Paris's convenient amnesia. And Paris, naturally, kept editing its own history. The 1920s remained romanticized, Hemingway drinking, Stein lecturing, the cafes bustling with genius and champagne. The heroine? Edited out. By the 1970s, even the city's own newspapers and dides avoided mentioning it, as if the needle never existed, or perhaps had always belonged to someone else. Marseille, the criminals, the shadowy corners of the docks. Tourists continued to flock to the left bank, imagining themselves in a literary dream. Meanwhile, the French Connection had quietly been dismantled. The heroin business survived, of course, but not with the same centralized glamour. Paris remained a symbol of culture and art, not narcotics. And isn't that just like history? The personal side. Of course, none of this happened without human cost. Many addicts suffered silently, both in France and abroad. Lives were destroyed, families ruined, futures stolen. The romanticized 1920s made for good stories, but the 1960s and 1970s were dominated by sorrow and struggle. And yet, the French and American authorities rarely focused on treatment in those early years. The approach was enforcement first, health second. Users were criminalized, not cared for. And that's part of why the French Connection remains infamous, not because Paris was glamorous, but because the trade touched millions quietly and tragically over decades. The long shadow. By the mid-1970s, the French Connection's decline was clear. Marseille labs were raided, the big gangs fragmented, and U.S. supply lines were disrupted. But the legacy remained. Heroin was no longer associated with artists and velvet jackets. It was associated with crime, addiction, and international networks. The irony is relentless. Paris made heroin chic in the 1920s, yet by the 1970s, the city was largely free of it. Marseille had made heroin profitable and global, yet remained overshadowed culturally by Paris. And American addicts, who were the main consumers, rarely knew or cared about either city. They just needed their next dose. Quiet lessons. So what can we take from this long, sleepy story? Heroin, like many trends, follows a predictable arc. Novelty, indulgence, collapse, mythologization. Paris gave it style. Marseille gave it scale. The rest of the world took it and suffered. And yet through it all, history tends to forget the inconvenient parts. The needles, the empty labs, the exhausted addicts. They vanish from stories, leaving behind only glamour, nostalgia, and myth. And that, in a sense, is the perfect bedtime ending for tonight. Not dramatic, not violent, just slow, continuous, inevitable decline. The heroin craze started as a glittering salon indulgence, became a global trade, and ended in shadows, quietly reshaping societies while Paris smiled and remembered only the beautiful bits. So as we let this history drift off into sleep, imagine the quiet irony. The city of lights, the city of art, the city of romance, forever linked in London to a drug that spent decades making the world a little sadder, a little weaker, and a little quieter.
By the late 1970s, the French Connection had mostly crumbled. Marseille labs had been raided, the Corsican gangs fragmented, and law enforcement had disrupted much of the trade. Paris itself, meanwhile, had remained mostly aloof, untouched by the wholesale smuggling that had brought headlines to New York and Boston. Yet, Paris had already done what it does best. It preserved its myth. And heroin, once glamorous in salons and cafes, became part of that myth, carefully edited, romanticized, and repackaged for culture. Literature keeps the memory alive. Authors, always eager to mine nostalgia, returned to the 1920s as a golden age of art, fashion, and decadence. Hemingway, Stein, Fitzgerald, the usual suspects, became icons. In heroin, it became a whispered presence. In novels, it was sometimes mentioned, but often with a wink, an indulgence for tortured geniuses, not a social problem. For example, memoirs and historical novels of the late 1970s and early 1980s would occasionally reference Cocteau, noting his struggles with the drug, but never in a sensationalized way. Instead, it was framed as a quirk of genius, a little tragic, a little sophisticated. Heroin was no longer a public menace in the Parisian imagination. It was a footnote, an accessory, like a velvet smoking jacket or an overused fountain pen. This selective memory was deliberate. Writers, publishers, and cultural institutions had an interest in preserving Paris as a city of light, not shadows. The truth of addiction, of quiet deaths and ruined lives, didn't fit neatly into the narrative of literary brilliance and cultural tourism. Film and visual culture. Film followed the same pattern. Films set in the 1920s, Paris of cafes and salons, rarely focused on addiction. Directors were more interested in romance, intrigue, existential angst. Occasionally, heroin would appear. A character might dabble or suffer, but it was always secondary. It was symbolic, not substantive, a marker of sophistication, rebellion, or despair. Interestingly, American films played a role in solidifying the myth. Movies like Midnight in Paris or retrospective noir dramas hinted at decadence, but left out the messy public health consequences. Paris became an aesthetic backdrop, elegant and dangerous in a poetic sense, but largely free of the practical realities of drugs. Heroin as a cultural echo. By the 1980s, heroin in Paris had largely disappeared from public life. The addicts who remained were marginalized, quiet, often invisible. Yet the cultural memory persisted. Tourists wandered the left bank, imagining salons filled with artists, while guides told them of genius, cafes, and existential debates, not of withdrawal symptoms, overdoses, or empty vials in the trash. This selective memory did more than erase tragedy. It reframed heroin as a cultural symbol. The drug represented rebellion, sophistication, artistic suffering. Paris itself became a metaphor for controlled chaos, glamorous on the surface, messy underneath, but always stylish. The global perspective. Interestingly, while Paris sanitized its history, the world continued to grapple with heroin. By the late 20th century, other countries faced epidemics that were far less glamorous. Urban centers in the US, Britain, and later Asia. Heroin was no longer chic. It was dangerous, criminalized, and heavily policed. Yet when people imagined Parisian heroin, they imagined something else entirely. Velvet sofas, dim cafes, poets scribbling notes in the corner. The actual history, the thousands of addicts, the small clinics, the shadowy alleys, was quietly erased. This is perhaps the most Parisian thing about it. Style and myth always triumph over mess and tragedy. The literary revival. In France itself, the literary revival of the late 20th century continued this pattern. Biographies of Cocteau, memoirs of Sartre and de Beauvoir, studies of Montparnasse cafes, all treated heroin as a footnote. The focus remained on art, culture, and intellectual innovation.
Even when heroin was central to a figure's life, it was often romanticized, a necessary evil, a symbol of genius, a tragic accessory. Meanwhile, historians who wanted to tell the fuller story had a harder job. Archival records existed, of course, hospital admissions, pharmacy records, police files, but these were less glamorous than memoirs or films. They didn't sell well to the public. The story of addiction, of social decay, of silent suffering remained in the shadows. Paris today. Myth versus reality. Modern Paris is a city of history and memory. Tourists can visit Hemingway's old haunts, sip espresso where Cocteau once wrote, and imagine the vibrant, chaotic, slightly dangerous world of the 1920s. Heroin is part of that memory, but only as a suggestion, a whisper of rebellion, a hint of decadence, a minor detail in a golden age. The reality, of course, was far less tidy. Addiction destroyed lives, quietly and without ceremony. Pharmacies were once sites of consumption, then control. Dock workers in Marseille quietly refined and shipped heroin, while police and politicians negotiated a slow, messy crackdown. And yet, culturally, Paris remains largely untouched by that history. The sleepy conclusion. So, as we drift toward the end of this part of our story, the lesson is subtle. Heroin in Paris is less about the substance itself and more about how society remembers it. A city can be glamorous, cultured, and creative while hiding its shadows. Decades later, people can admire the myth without seeing the pain. And isn't that, in the end, the gentle lesson of all history? That the stories we tell and the stories we remember are carefully curated. That behind every glamorous narrative, there are quiet tragedies. That Paris, like all of us, is both beautiful and flawed, remembered and forgotten, elevated and quietly sorrowful. By the late 1970s, the French Connection had been disrupted, Marseille's labs raided, and the Corsican networks partially dismantled. Heroin was no longer flowing through Parisian cafes, nor was it a glamorous accessory for the literary elite. But like most substances, it doesn't vanish entirely. It retreats, it hides, it adapts. And in Paris, heroin quietly persisted, mostly underground, threading through youth subcultures, nightclubs, and forgotten neighborhoods. The shift to youth culture. The 1970s and 1980s in Paris saw a growing youth culture, as in much of Europe. Punk, rock, and later hip-hop began to take hold. Young people congregated in bars, clubs, and squats. They were less interested in existentialist philosophy and more interested in music, rebellion, and identity. Heroin, cheap and potent, found its place in this new scene, not as a fashionable indulgence, but as a quiet escape, a private rebellion, or a tool for enduring boredom and hardship. Unlike the salons of the 1920s, this was not glamorous. No one wrote poetry while injecting. No one wore velvet smoking jackets. The subculture of the time was gritty, unpolished, urban. Heroin use was hidden, even among friends. Clinics and hospitals recorded increasing cases of overdoses, withdrawal symptoms, and long-term addiction. The romantic aura of Parisian heroin was gone, replaced by a practical reality. People were struggling, quietly, and largely invisible to the rest of the city. Nightclubs and underground scenes. Despite this, the city's nightlife offered a peculiar mix of freedom and danger. Underground clubs, sometimes illegal, sometimes semi-legal, hosted bands, DJs, and dancers. Heroin was present in these spaces, though discreetly.
it was not celebrated. It was simply part of the milieu, a shadow lurking behind neon lights and bass-heavy music. Police and local authorities were aware, but enforcement was selective. Paris, like most large cities, had bigger problems. Heroin use was rising in some neighborhoods, but the city's image remained paramount. Tourists continued to visit the left bank, thinking of cafes and art galleries, largely unaware of the underground struggles in other arrondissements. The cultural contrast. Here's the interesting part. In the public imagination, heroin continued to be tied to the glamour of the 1920s. Artists and intellectuals were still revered. Tourists read about Cocteau, Hemingway, and Stein, never realizing that by the 1980s, heroin was no longer about sophistication. It was about survival, addiction, and marginalization. This contrast is essential to understanding Paris's unique relationship with the drug. On the surface, the city retained its myth of intellectual elegance. Beneath that surface, young people and marginalized groups were quietly fighting a much harsher reality. History in this sense is layered. Myths float on top, while the messy, difficult truth simmers underneath. The persistence of addiction. Heroin addiction in Paris never fully disappeared. Even after the French Connection ended, small networks of dealers persisted. Neighborhoods in the north of the city in particular saw chronic use. Clinics and harm reduction programs slowly emerged, but resources were limited. Addiction remained quiet, largely hidden problem. This persistence was ironic. The city that had once glamorized heroin in salons now had to manage a public health issue that was invisible to most. The romantic memory of the 1920s remained intact, untouched by the struggles of the late 20th century. Paris had effectively compartmentalized its history: glamour above, shadow below, memory selective, reality persistent. Literature and film in the late 20th century. Writers and filmmakers continued to explore the Paris of the past, but heroin's role was almost always symbolic. Films set in the 1920s or earlier used heroin as a marker of decadence, rebellion, or artistic suffering, rarely acknowledging the real-life consequences. Literature followed the same pattern. Memoirs mentioned drug use, but often in passing, or as a footnote to genius and creativity. Meanwhile, contemporary stories of youth addiction were largely ignored or sanitized. Heroin remained in the background, present but invisible, like a persistent hum beneath the city's elegant surface. Tourism, myth, and reality. By the 1980s and 1990s, Paris had fully embraced its myth for tourists. The left bank was celebrated for literary cafes, Montmartre for its artists and painters. Even nightlife and music were packaged as glamorous or quaint. Heroin, if it existed in these narratives at all, was always a faded echo of a stylish past. The reality of underground heroin use, overdoses, lost jobs, broken families were quietly contained in reports, clinics, and police files. The city's cultural memory had separated the glamorous 1920s from the gritty present. Tourists could sip coffee, admire architecture, and imagine a lost age of sophistication, entirely unaware that decades of addiction had quietly persisted beneath their feet. Quiet lessons. The story of heroin in Paris from the 1970s to the 1990s teaches something subtle. Myths are persistent, and reality is often invisible. Paris maintained its image as a city of light, art, and culture, while addiction quietly continued in the shadows.
The glamorous 1920s remained intact in memory, untouched by the slow, quiet consequences of decades of heroin use. And that, perhaps in the most Parisian ending imaginable, is the city remembered as beautiful, cultured, and sophisticated, while the darker truths lie quietly in alleys, clinics, and the corners of history. By the 1990s, Paris had quietly changed. The city still carried the weight of its myth. Cafes, literary salons, Montmartre's painters, jazz spilling from basement clubs. Heroin, however, was largely invisible to the tourists, largely contained to quiet, marginalized networks. Yet, even in this near invisibility, Paris had a lasting influence on global perceptions of the drug. Paris as a symbol. For much of the world, Paris became shorthand for sophistication, romance, and rebellion. Heroin's historical presence there, once glamorous in salons, later central to international trade, fed into a narrative that was mostly aesthetic. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers outside France often referenced Parisian heroin as a symbol rather than a problem, a cultural artifact, a relic of artistic rebellion. This perception was convenient. It allowed countries grappling with heroin epidemics to externalize the problem. Paris became a kind of legend, a way of saying addiction can be glamorous elsewhere. Meanwhile, the actual city quietly implemented public health measures to manage the ongoing, very real presence of heroin. Early harm reduction programs. In the 1980s and 1990s, France began to experiment with harm reduction programs. These were slow, cautious, and sometimes controversial. Needle exchanges, substitution treatments like methadone, and outreach programs appeared in some districts. The aim was simple: reduce the harms of heroin use without necessarily eliminating it entirely. These programs were pragmatic. Paris had learned a lesson over decades. Glamorizing or demonizing heroin didn't change its existence. People would still use, often quietly. The city's approach was, in some ways, clinical: contain the damage, prevent deaths, and manage addiction as a public health problem rather than a moral failing. Interestingly, these programs coexisted with the city's myth. Tourists still wandered the left bank, imagining artists and intellectuals. Underground addiction quietly persisted, now slightly less deadly thanks to public health measures. History had a way of compartmentalizing: myth above, harm reduction below, reality always subdued. Influence on global policy. Parisian approaches also influenced broader European strategies. Other countries observed needle exchanges and methadone programs with interest. The French model suggested that managing addiction required more than policing. It required care, infrastructure, and social awareness. Of course, not every country adopted this approach. Some preferred strict criminalization, but Paris's quiet example, treating heroin users as human beings rather than criminals, helped seed ideas that would slowly spread across Europe in the late 20th century. The myth persists. Meanwhile, in culture, heroin in Paris continued to occupy a paradoxical space. The glamorous 1920s remained immortalized in literature and film. The French Connection era fascinated historians and filmmakers. Youth subcultures of the 1970s and 1980s were largely invisible or sanitized in popular accounts. In short, Paris had managed a delicate balancing act: contain the real problems quietly while preserving an image that was safe, attractive, and marketable. The myth was intact, the reality was managed, and history, slow, selective, and slightly ironic, kept drifting forward, as gentle as a lullaby. Into the 21st century. By the turn of the millennium, heroin was no longer part of the public consciousness in Paris in the way it had been in the 1920s or even during the French Connection. Public health programs were in place. Law enforcement continued to monitor drug trafficking. Harm reduction had matured. Yet the myth remained stubborn. Tourists and culture seekers still associated Paris with romance, sophistication, and subtle rebellion. Writers and filmmakers occasionally referenced heroin, but almost always as a symbol of decadence, nostalgia, or artistic struggle, rather than a pressing contemporary problem. The gentle irony. And here, as always, is the quiet, almost sleepy irony that the city that had popularized heroin in the salons of the 1920s, that had been central to the global trade in the mid-20th century, had largely solved its visible problem by the 21st century. But Paris's image as a city of art, intellect, and subtle danger persisted. The myth survived. The shadow receded, but never disappeared entirely. For those interested in history, this is the subtle lesson. Events, substances, and behaviors can be dramatically altered by time, policy, and perception, but myths, carefully curated, tend to endure. Paris did not become a cautionary tale of heroin addiction. Instead, it remained a city of culture and legend, quietly managing its realities out of sight. The quiet continuation. Even now, as Paris continues to attract millions of visitors each year, the undercurrents remain. Addiction has not vanished entirely. It has merely been managed, quietly and pragmatically. Clinics, needle exchanges, and harm reduction programs continue to operate. Social workers and health professionals do their work without fanfare. The city's cultural memory, meanwhile, remains glamorous, selective, and slightly ironic. Tourists imagine literary salons, jazz cafes, and artistic rebellion, blissfully unaware of the decades of quiet struggle happening in parallel. History, in this sense, is both preserved and gently edited, allowing the city to maintain its image while quietly tending to its realities. Bedtime reflection. So, as we drift toward the end of this part of our story, imagine Paris at night in the 21st century. Streetlights glow softly on cobblestones. Cafes hum with conversation. Tourists sip espresso, imagining literary legends and glamorous artists. Underground, quietly, addiction persists. Managed, but present. The myth and the reality coexist. One floats on the surface, polished, curated, remembered. The other simmers quietly beneath, visible only to those paying attention. And that is perhaps the most Parisian lesson of all. Beauty and tragedy coexist. History edits itself, and myths endure longer than the shadows they obscure.
By the early 2000s, Paris had fully transitioned into its modern form. The city was bustling, cosmopolitan, and, as always, beautiful in its curated way. Tourists continued to flock to the left bank, Montmartre, or the Marais. Cafes thrived. Galleries and museums drew crowds. The Paris remembered in literature and film, the city of light, romance, and intellectual rebellion, remained intact. Yet, beneath this polished surface, heroin quietly persisted, though in far smaller and more contained forms than in the 1920 salons or the French Connection era. The modern Parisian drug scene is less glamorous, less poetic, and far more pragmatic. heroin is largely part of public health discussions, harm reduction programs, and law enforcement records, rather than the subject of memoirs or novels. France, and Paris specifically, has developed one of the more organized approaches to managing heroin use in Europe. Needle exchange programs are well established. Supervised consumption rooms exist in some districts, offering users a controlled environment and access to medical support. Methadone and buprenorphine treatments are widely available, providing substitutes that reduce harm and the risk of overdose. This is a far cry from the 1920s, when heroin was glamorized in literary salons, or the 1950s, when it fueled global smuggling operations. Modern policy treats heroin pragmatically. It exists, people will use it, so the goal is to minimize harm. There's no glamour, no fashionable rebellion, no aesthetic value, just quiet management. Law enforcement and the city's image. At the same time, Paris remains fiercely protective of its cultural image. Enforcement is strategic. The city avoids large-scale, publicized crackdowns in areas frequented by tourists. Instead, operations are discreet, targeting supply chains, street-level distribution, and organized crime. The city's myth is intact. Cafes, galleries, and historic streets appear untouched, serene, and timeless. The irony is familiar. Paris, once central to international heroin trade, now balances reality and myth carefully. Heroin persists, but it is largely invisible. Visitors experience the curated version: art, romance, light, culture. The shadows exist, but are contained, largely unnoticed unless one seeks them out. Cultural memory in the 21st century. Even in literature, film, and media, heroin in Paris continues to occupy a paradoxical space. References exist, but they are almost always historical or symbolic. The 1920s Salon era is romanticized. The French Connection era is dramatized in crime films. Modern heroin use, however, is rarely depicted aesthetically. It is a public health concern, social issue, or criminal matter. Paris's cultural memory, then, is selective. Heroin is remembered as part of myth and history, not as a current problem. The city's role in addiction is present in medical journals, social work reports, and specialized studies, but largely absent from the tourist narrative. The myth endures, the shadow is quietly managed. Youth and heroin today. Contemporary youth culture in Paris is diverse. Music, nightlife, and street culture continue to thrive. Heroin exists within this ecosystem, but its prevalence is low compared to other substances, such as cannabis, alcohol, or increasingly synthetic drugs. Where heroin does exist, harm reduction programs provide support, reducing fatalities and serious health consequences. Unlike the 1970s and 1980s, heroin use is not a symbol of rebellion. It is a reality to manage, often linked to social marginalization, economic hardship, or personal struggle. There is no aesthetic appeal, no cultural glamour, just practical support systems quietly operating in the background. Tourism, myth, and irony. Tourists, of course, remain blissfully unaware.
They sip espresso in Montparnasse, wander cobblestone streets, and imagine literary figures debating over coffee and cigarettes. The heroine of history, whether salon chic, French Connection logistics, or underground youth culture, is mostly invisible. It is a whisper beneath the city's polished surface. The irony is quintessentially Parisian. The city that once glamorized heroin and later facilitated a global trade now manages addiction discreetly while preserving an image of timeless culture. Myth and reality coexist, separate but intertwined. Visitors experience myth, locals quietly manage reality. Literature and film. Modern literature and film continue to reflect this duality. Historical novels reference heroin as a marker of decadence or artistic struggle. Crime films explore the French Connection era. Contemporary stories about drug use tend to focus on social issues, public health, or criminal justice. The aesthetic, romanticized heroine of the 1920s exists only in memory and selective cultural production. Even educational and historical accounts often emphasize narrative over harm. Readers and viewers learn about the glamour of salons, the intrigue of smuggling, the tragedy of addiction, but rarely all at once. The story is compartmentalized, just as Paris itself compartmentalizes its history, beautiful above, shadowed below. The quiet persistence. Heroin has not disappeared from Paris. It persists quietly among marginalized populations, managed through public health programs and discreet law enforcement. Overdose rates are reduced compared to past decades. Access to treatment is improved. The city's approach is pragmatic, clinical, and quiet. Yet Paris's cultural memory remains largely untouchable. Tourists see cafes, galleries, and literary landmarks. Films and books reference glamorous history. The public health reality, the decades of addiction, the quiet struggles, the marginalized users, remains largely invisible unless one seeks it out. Bedtime reflection. So, as we drift toward the end of this modern chapter, imagine Paris today. Streets lit softly by lamplight, cafes humming with conversation, galleries echoing with footsteps. Somewhere beneath the surface, heroin persists in small, managed forms. Clinics operate quietly. Harm reduction saves lives. Enforcement quietly ensures supply chains are disrupted. Above ground, myth and memory dominate. The city is elegant, cultured, timeless. Tourists wander streets imagining salons, writers, and jazz cafes. Beneath the surface, history quietly hums on. The city balances myth, reality, and public health with quiet efficiency. And that, perhaps, is the gentle, sleepy conclusion for tonight. A city that remembers only what it wants to remember, a substance that persists quietly in the shadows, and a myth that endures far longer than the reality it obscures.
By the early 21st century, Paris's role in the history of heroin had transformed entirely. The city was no longer the glamorous hub of literary indulgence or the central node in the French Connection smuggling network. Yet the story of heroin in Paris had ripple effects far beyond its borders, shaping perceptions, policies, and cultural myths around the world. The international echo. Heroin from Paris and Marseille had once reached New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and countless other cities across the Atlantic. The trade was enormous in scale and carefully organized. By the 1970s, law enforcement crackdowns had disrupted this network, but the echo remained. Countries around the world, especially the United States, now associated heroin with organized crime, urban decay, and tragedy. Paris, in contrast, retained a sort of historical detachment. The city had glamorized heroin in the 1920s salons, and later the media and film dramatized the French connection. For those who never experienced the trade firsthand, heroin became entwined with myth, not reality. Paris, then, became a kind of cultural shorthand for sophistication, rebellion, and artistic melancholy, rather than a warning about addiction. Cultural soft power. In a way, Paris's heroin story contributed to the city's soft power. Writers, filmmakers, and artists perpetuated the romanticized image of the city. Tourists, eager to wander the left bank, sip espresso, and imagine literary debates, absorbed the myth without confronting the darker reality. Ironically, this soft power relied on selective memory. Public health crisis, quiet addiction, and decades of underground trade were almost entirely absent from popular narratives. The city curated its history as carefully as it curates its architecture. Myth, elegance, and cultural prestige survived, while reality simmered quietly below the surface. Lessons for international policy. Paris's experience also offered lessons for international drug policy. By the late 20th century, harm reduction, needle exchanges, substitution therapy, supervised consumption became more accepted across Europe and beyond. France's programs in the 1980s and 1990s quietly influenced policy debates in other countries. The lesson was pragmatic. Drugs do not disappear simply because they are illegal or stigmatized. They adapt, move, and persist. Managing addiction requires infrastructure, public health measures, and social support, not merely criminalization or moral condemnation. Paris's experience offered a model for quietly reducing harm while preserving cultural and social stability. Myth versus reality. The story of heroin in Paris is perhaps the perfect case study in the tension between myth and reality. Tourists and admirers see salons, cafes, jazz clubs, and literary figures. The glamorous history is well documented and endlessly retold. Meanwhile, the gritty, mundane reality, the struggles of addicts, the quiet underground networks, and decades of public health work remain largely invisible unless one deliberately seeks it out. Paris, like history itself, edits what it wants to remember. Glamour endures. Shadows are managed. Tragedy persists quietly beneath the surface. The social dimension. Even today, heroin use is largely confined to marginalized populations in Paris. Social inequality, economic hardship, and urban isolation are common factors among users. Harm reduction programs operate discreetly, minimizing risk and offering support. This compartmentalization mirrors the city's approach to myth. Just as tourists experience a curated version of Paris's literary past, the city manages its present reality of addiction quietly. The public face is timeless, cultured, and beautiful. The private reality is pragmatic, clinical, and largely invisible. Reflections on history. The history of heroin in Paris offers subtle reflections for anyone willing to drift slowly through its layers. First, history is selective.
Paris remembers the glamour, elegance, and cultural influence of its past, often at the expense of the darker truths. Second, reality persists quietly. Addiction, harm, and human struggle do not disappear because society chooses to ignore them. They are merely managed or hidden. And finally, myths endure. The idea of Paris as a city of artistic rebellion, intellectual conversation, and subtle decadence remains compelling, precisely because it ignores inconvenient details. Heroin, once part of that narrative, has been reduced to a whisper, a historical footnote, a shadow that hints at risk but does not dominate the story. Global cultural memory. Internationally, Paris's myth influences how heroin is remembered and imagined. Literature, film, and journalism often reference the city as a symbol of artistic sophistication and cultural rebellion. The realities of addiction in other cities, New York, London, or Marseille, receive more practical attention, while Paris serves as a symbolic backdrop, a reminder of elegance and decadence. This duality, reality managed quietly, myth preserved boldly, illustrates a broader principle about history and culture. Myths are sticky. They endure long after the actual events fade. Reality, however, requires management, adaptation, and careful oversight. Paris's heroine story demonstrates this principle beautifully, quietly, and without drama. Perfect for bedtime reflection. Quiet ironies. And of course, there are gentle ironies to consider. The city that once glamorized heroin now contains it quietly, under the radar of tourists and casual observers. The city that was central to global smuggling now serves as a model for harm reduction. The same substance that fueled literary salons and later international trade now exists largely in pragmatic, medicalized contexts. History has a way of balancing itself. Glamour fades, reality persists, myths endure, and the world quietly adapts. Paris exemplifies this delicate equilibrium, a city remembered for beauty, while quietly managing complexity beneath the surface. Bedtime reflection. So as we drift toward the end of this part, imagine Paris today. Cobblestone streets glow under lamplight, cafes murmur with conversation, galleries echo with footsteps. Tourists wander imagining literary salons, jazz clubs, and intellectual debates. Beneath the surface, quietly, heroin persists. Harm reduction programs operate, health professionals manage addiction, and law enforcement monitors supply. The city's myth remains intact, untouched by reality. Shadows exist, but they are discreet, managed, and largely invisible to those who only glance at the surface. And that is, in the gentle monotone of history, perhaps the ultimate lesson. Myth endures, reality persists, and history drifts forward quietly, leaving only whispers of its shadows behind. By the early 21st century, Paris had largely resolved the visible consequences of its heroin history. Yet in the arts, literature, and cultural imagination, the substance remained a potent symbol, a way of representing rebellion, decadence, and artistic struggle without touching the harsher realities. Heroin as artistic symbol. Heroin in Parisian culture has often functioned more as metaphor than as substance. Writers, painters, and filmmakers rarely depict the physical act of use for its own sake. Instead, heroin represents indulgence, escapism, melancholy, or the fragile edge between genius and self-destruction.
For example, in novels set in the 1920s or during the French Connection era, a character might be dabbling in heroin or haunted by the allure of the needle. But the narrative never dwells on withdrawal, overdose, or social consequences. The drug exists in literature as an accessory, like a velvet jacket or a cigarette holder, symbolic, stylish, and a little tragic. Painters and visual artists have also referenced heroin subtly. Abstract works or portraits sometimes evoke languor, melancholy, or otherworldliness, qualities historically associated with addiction. Heroin becomes a shorthand for existential struggle rather than a public health concern. It is, in a sense, Paris's artistic equivalent of a whisper, present but understated, meaningful but quiet. Film and media references. Cinema continues the same pattern. Films exploring historical Paris often hint at heroin, but rarely explore addiction concretely. Directors use it to evoke mood, time, or character depth. In documentaries, heroin is discussed with clinical detachment, its history, its trade, its consequences. But in fictional portrayals, it almost always carries a cultural or symbolic weight. It is elegant, dangerous, artistic, or tragic, but never mundane. Even contemporary Parisian youth culture is largely sanitized in media portrayals. While heroin exists in marginalized communities, mainstream stories focus on romance, nightlife, or music. Addiction is abstract, often relegated to the background, while the city itself remains timeless and cultured. Memory versus reality. This duality, memory versus reality, is central to understanding Paris and heroin. The city preserves glamorous history while quietly managing ongoing issues. Tourists see salons, jazz clubs, and literary icons. Artists reference decadence. Films and novels evoke melancholy and intellectual struggle. Meanwhile, addiction continues quietly, contained through harm reduction, medical treatment, and targeted enforcement. The streets are safer than they were in the mid-20th century. Overdoses are fewer, and heroin's public visibility is minimal. Reality is managed. Memory is curated. Myth endures. Educational and historical perspectives. Academics and historians, of course, paint a fuller picture. Research papers, historical texts, and public health studies examine heroin in Paris comprehensively. Its role in literature, the French Connection, youth subcultures, and public health policy. These accounts are meticulous, but often removed from cultural memory. While history records overdoses, smuggling networks, and public health interventions, popular imagination prefers the aestheticized version, heroin as a symbol of rebellion, sophistication, and melancholy. This selective memory is not unique to Paris. Cities, societies, and cultures often remember what they find appealing or meaningful and quietly tuck away the inconvenient details. In Paris, the effect is particularly pronounced thanks to the city's global cultural image and long history of curating image and myth. Reflections on cultural legacy. Heroin's symbolic legacy in Paris raises subtle questions about art, culture, and memory. How much of history should be curated for mythic appeal? How much should be preserved in its raw, sometimes unpleasant reality? Paris demonstrates that it is possible to maintain a global cultural image while quietly managing difficult realities. The city is elegant, refined, and timeless in the eyes of the world.
Beneath that surface, reality persists. Addiction, marginalization, and public health challenges. Myth floats above reality, curated and enduring. Quiet ironies. There are gentle ironies throughout Paris's heroine story. The city that once glamorized the drug in salons now contains it quietly. The city that fueled a global smuggling network now serves as an example of harm reduction pragmatism. Heroin, once central to image and allure, is now largely symbolic, an aesthetic or intellectual marker rather than a tangible issue for most of the population. Even in art and literature, the irony persists. References to heroin evoke tragedy, sophistication, and rebellion, rarely the mundane, everyday struggles of addiction. Cultural memory emphasizes beauty, melancholy, and myth, while reality is compartmentalized, managed, and discreet. Paris today, myth and management. Modern Paris balances myth and management with quiet precision. Tourists and admirers experience timeless streets, cafes, galleries, and cultural landmarks. The public image remains intact, sophisticated, artistic, and elegant. At the same time, addiction is quietly addressed. Clinics, harm reduction programs, and medical interventions support those who continue to use heroin. Law enforcement disrupts supply chains discreetly. Social workers and medical professionals operate largely out of sight, ensuring that reality is contained without intruding upon the city's curated image. This balance, myth preserved above and reality managed below, is perhaps the most Parisian lesson of all. The city teaches that history is not merely a record of events, but also a curated narrative, selective, elegant, and sometimes ironic. Bedtime reflection. So as we drift toward the end of this part, imagine Paris today. Cobblestones glow under soft streetlights. Cafes murmur with conversation. Galleries echo with footsteps. Tourists imagine literary salons, jazz clubs, and intellectual debates. Beneath the surface, heroin persists quietly in marginalized communities. Clinics and harm reduction programs operate discreetly. Law enforcement disrupts supply chains with minimal disruption to public perception. Myth and memory float on the surface. Reality persists quietly below. And that, in the gentle monotone of history, is perhaps the ultimate bedtime thought. Myths endure longer than realities. Beauty coexists with shadow. And Paris continues to balance elegance with quiet pragmatism, whispering its secrets only to those willing to listen.